Amelia Matthews stood at the doorstep of a house that, until this moment, had only existed in her imagination. The cool breeze of early autumn brushed against her face, but she hardly noticed. Her mind was clouded with a mix of nerves and curiosity. It was a feeling she had carried for years, an uneasy, persistent question that had never quite gone away. Why had they left her? Why had her biological parents decided, in their hearts, that she was unworthy of their love? She was 25 now, accomplished in ways that many could only dream of. An acclaimed artist known for her sculptures, a model who had graced magazines, and a staunch advocate for those deemed different. Amelia had proven herself to be much more than the child abandoned at Hope's Haven orphanage so many years ago. She had transformed her pain into beauty, sculpting pieces that captured the essence of human emotion, imperfection, and resilience. But despite all the accolades and recognition, one question still haunted her. Who were the people who had rejected her? The doorbell rang with a familiar chime, echoing through the air as if announcing Judgment Day. Amelia's slender fingers trembled on the doorbell button, a gesture that made her feel like a child again. It had been 18 years since she had seen her parents' faces, minus 18 years since they left her in a basket on the doorstep of the orphanage, with nothing more than a hastily written note that read, "We can't take care of her. Please find her a good home." The words had stung when she first read them. Even now, the memory of that cold, impersonal note lingered in her mind. Amelia Matthews. The voice from the other side of the door broke her thoughts. She turned to see a man standing there, a figure with salt and pepper hair and a face lined with age, a face that somehow reminded her of a life she once had, or maybe a life she could never have. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I need to speak with Rachel and Henry Matthews." The door opened wider, and for the first time, Amelia found herself looking directly at her father. He was no longer the young man she imagined from the old photographs, but there was no mistaking the eyes that had once rejected her, the same eyes that seemed to avoid hers now. Henry Matthews, her father, stood in front of her, a stranger with the same blood running through his veins. "Please come in," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Rachel is inside. She's been expecting you." As Amelia stepped inside, the weight of the moment pressed upon her. The house was well kept, a picture of suburban comfort. She had imagined it to be cold and sterile, the kind of home that reflected the distance she had always felt, but it was warm, lived in, decorated with family portraits and holiday trinkets. The reality of the space, of the life her parents had built without her, hit her harder than she had expected. Rachel Matthews was seated on the couch, her posture rigid. Her appearance had changed over the years, but Amelia could still see the woman from the photographs, the woman who had once been her mother. Her features were more refined, her face softer now, but the coldness that had once defined her was still present in the way she held herself. There was no sign of warmth, no sign of the love a mother should have for her child. "Amelia," Rachel said quietly, almost as if she were unsure of what to say. "Thank you for coming." The words stung. Thank you for coming. Was that it? Was that all she was worth? Just a thank you after 18 years of silence, after being left to grow up alone in a system that had no room for her. Amelia didn't know how to respond. She had imagined this moment so many times. She had rehearsed the words she would say, the accusations she would hurl, the questions she needed answered. But now, standing in the room with the people who had made the ultimate decision to abandon her, words escaped her. The years of hurt, the years of living without answers, seemed to drain all her strength. As she stood there, caught between the past and the present, her mind raced. She thought of her time at Hope's Haven, the memories of Mrs. Clara, the woman who had raised her as her own. She thought of the children in the orphanage who had shown her the cruelty of the world and how she had learned to rise above it all. Amelia's childhood had been defined by rejection, but it was also defined by resilience. It was her art that had kept her afloat, the act of creating beauty out of chaos that had allowed her to find purpose. But now, in front of the people who had given her life and then taken it away. The words felt meaningless. What could she say? How could she possibly explain the pain that had shaped her every step? "I didn't come here to accuse you," Amelia finally said, her voice breaking through the tension in the room. "I didn't come here to punish you. I came here to show you what you gave up, to show you that I'm not the child you left behind. I'm someone who's made a life, someone who's found purpose even without you." Rachel's eyes flickered with a mixture of guilt and something else Amelia couldn't quite identify. Henry stood silently by the door, his face unreadable. The awkward silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. "I know this isn't easy," Amelia continued, her words coming more freely now. "But I need you to see me. I need you to see the person I became, even though you turned your back on me." The room seemed to close in around her as Rachel looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I never wanted to leave you, Amelia," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "But I couldn't bear to raise you. I couldn't handle the way you looked. I was ashamed. I thought you deserved better." The admission struck Amelia like a blow. Ashamed. She had always wondered if it was something like this, something rooted in her parents' shame. But hearing the words fall from Rachel's lips, felt like a sharp, painful confirmation of everything she had feared. "And did I deserve better?" Amelia asked, her voice quiet but firm. Rachel's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't speak. Henry looked at her, his face tense, as if he too were finally realizing the weight of the decision they had made so many years ago. Amelia turned away, her heart pounding in her chest. She had come here for answers, but now that she had them, she wasn't sure they would ever be enough. Amelia Matthews stood in the center of her studio, the weight of her parents' words still lingering in the air. She had come here to confront them, to seek validation for the life she had built without them. But now, faced with the rawness of their rejection, her mind was a whirlwind. For so many years, she had imagined this moment, what she would say, how she would feel. But nothing had prepared her for the truth. The sting of her mother's admission that she had abandoned her out of shame was still sharp, reverberating through her heart. But it was the same truth she had known deep down her entire life. She had spent years trying to push away the feeling that her parents had made a choice that she could never undo. And now, standing alone in her studio, Amelia had to face something even more profound. The question of whether she could ever truly forgive them. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't just for them. It was something she had to give herself. With a sigh, she turned to the unfinished sculpture on the table before her. Clay, her trusted medium, was both her refuge and her voice. For years, sculpting had been her escape, a way to pour out her emotions when words failed her. The art had become a mirror to her soul, each piece reflecting the pain and beauty of her journey. But now, as her fingers caressed the cold, malleable material, she felt something new, an emptiness. For the first time in years, the clay felt unyielding, resistant. Amelia had never understood why the world felt the need to categorize people. Why was her appearance any different from someone else's? She had grown up being told that she didn't fit the mold, that her facial features, her downward slanting eyes, her recessed chin, were flaws to be corrected. The cruelty of childhood had followed her into adulthood, and though she had achieved incredible success as a sculptor and model, the harsh memories of schoolyard rejection still haunted her. It was those same memories that returned to her in the silence of the studio as her fingers struggled to mold the clay. As a child, Amelia had always been different. She remembered the first day she went to school, the way the other children had looked at her with curiosity and fear. "What happened to your face?" a classmate had asked her during recess, his voice a mixture of innocence and cruelty. The memory still stung, as though the words had been spoken just yesterday. But it was Mrs. Clara, her guardian and the caretaker at Hope's Haven Orphanage, who had taught her to rise above it. "You are more than your face, Amelia," Mrs. Clara had said to her, day after day. "The world might look at you and see something different, but that's because they haven't learned to see the beauty in uniqueness. You must teach them, not with your words, but with your art. And so Amelia did. She poured herself into her sculptures, creating pieces that reflected not just her own struggles, but the struggles of others who had been cast aside by society. She became known for her raw, emotive work that spoke of resilience, of fighting against the odds. But the rejection she faced, whether from her peers or from the world at large, never completely went away. It had shaped her, just as much as her art had. It wasn't until Amelia's 16th birthday that she began to truly understand the power of her art. That year, she was invited to participate in an art showcase at a local community center. She had been working on a piece she called Rebirth, a sculpture of a woman emerging from the clay, broken yet whole. It was an image of herself, one she had longed to see for years, the woman who had been left behind, but had found a way to stand tall, to rise above her circumstances. The night of the exhibit, Amelia stood beside her work, watching as visitors walked past, their eyes lingering on her piece. But as the night wore on, she began to notice something strange. People weren't just admiring her art, they were connecting with it. A woman in her 30s stopped in front of Rebirth and began to cry. Amelia hesitated, unsure whether to approach her, but the woman noticed her, wiped her tears away, and smiled. "Your work, it speaks to me," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's like you've captured everything I felt my whole life. The rejection, the pain, the healing. It's all there." For the first time, Amelia realized that her art wasn't just a reflection of her own journey. It was a reflection of everyone who had ever felt out of place, everyone who had been overlooked or dismissed. And in that moment, Amelia found a sense of purpose that went beyond the art itself. Her sculptures weren't just about her. They were about all the people who needed to see their own struggles reflected back at them. Despite the success she had achieved, Amelia still struggled with the feeling of being an outsider. The art world had embraced her, yes, but it was not without its challenges. There were whispers behind closed doors, questions about her appearance, and whether she had earned her place in the industry. In the beginning, it stung. It made her wonder whether she truly belonged, or if her art had simply become a token of her difference. But as the years passed, she realized that her difference was exactly what made her work so powerful. Her mentor, Julian Weston, was the first person to show her that her art wasn't just an escape, it was a weapon. "Your hands, Amelia, they are your strength," he had told her. "The way you sculpt, the way you shape the clay, it's your way of making sense of the world. Don't let anyone take that from you." With Julian's guidance, Amelia began to see her art in a new light. The imperfections, the flaws in her sculptures, were not something to hide. They were part of the story, part of the beauty. Each crack in the clay, each asymmetrical figure, told the story of resilience. And as Amelia's fame grew, she began to see the impact her work was having on others. People weren't just admiring her art, they were finding their own voices through it. But despite her success, the rejection still stung. The world, though it had embraced her as an artist, had yet to fully accept her as a person. And as she stood in her studio, the unfinished sculpture in front of her, Amelia knew that her journey was far from over. Her art had given her a voice, but she still had a long road ahead before she could fully accept herself. In the quiet of her studio, Amelia realized that art was not just about creating beauty, it was about healing. And as long as she continued to create, to mold the clay with her hands and pour her soul into every piece, she knew that she was taking one step closer to healing the wounds that had been with her for so long. Amelia Matthews sat at her desk, her fingers nervously tapping against the cold surface as she stared at the letter in front of her. It was official. She was about to confront the people who had abandoned her at Hope's Haven Orphanage 18 years ago. The weight of the decision pressed down on her chest, and despite all her accomplishments, the prospect of seeing her birth parents for the first time felt terrifying. She had envisioned this moment countless times, replaying the scene in her mind 1,000 ways. But now, as the day drew closer, the reality felt different. The anger that had once burned so brightly had dimmed, replaced with an uncertain mix of curiosity, vulnerability, and a deep-seated desire for closure. The letter she had written was simple yet direct. It was not a letter seeking forgiveness or answers. It was an invitation to confront the ghosts of her past. Amelia had chosen to meet them on her terms, not to accuse them, but to show them who she had become, despite their rejection. The letter read, "Dear Rachel and Henry Matthews, my name is Amelia Matthews. I was born to you on May 17th, 2002, and was left at Hope's Haven Orphanage shortly after. I have spent many years learning about the person I am and creating a life I'm proud of. I would like to meet you. I won't ask for explanations or apologies, but I believe we both deserve this. I will be at your home on June 1st at 2:00 p.m. Please come, or don't, but I will be there." Her heart raced as she sealed the envelope. She had been preparing for this moment her entire life, but now that it was real, she felt a strange sense of trepidation. Amelia had faced rejection from countless people throughout her life, but this was different. This was the very core of her identity, the foundation of everything she had built, now standing in front of her, just a doorstep away. The day of the meeting arrived sooner than she expected. Amelia stood outside the Matthews house, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. The house in front of her was large, well-kept, the kind of home she had always imagined her parents living in, a picture-perfect family life that had no room for someone like her. But despite its charm, the house didn't seem warm. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like the manifestation of everything she had been denied. The stability, the comfort, the love that should have been hers. She rang the doorbell, and the sound seemed to reverberate through the silence, breaking the stillness of the afternoon. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest as she heard footsteps approach from inside. The door opened, and standing in front of her was a man who resembled the man in the photographs she had seen over the years. Henry Matthews, her father, looked older than the image she had kept in her mind. A little thinner, his hair graying at the temples. His eyes, though, were unmistakable, the same eyes that had once looked at her with judgment and then turned away. "Amelia?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. His gaze flickered to the envelope she was holding in her hand. He had likely seen the letter already, but there was something about him that made it clear he wasn't prepared for this moment. "Yes," Amelia answered, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm here." Henry stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The interior of the house was just as she had imagined, tastefully decorated, immaculate, and entirely devoid of any sign of her presence. There were no photos of her, no mementos of the child they had left behind. This place, this life, was built around the absence of the daughter they had chosen to forget. Rachel Matthews, her mother, sat on the couch, her posture rigid. She looked older than Amelia had expected, but there was something eerily familiar about the way she held herself. Rachel's beauty, once defined by youthful grace, was now softened by age. But her eyes, the same eyes Amelia had once hoped to see filled with love, were empty, distant. "Amelia," Rachel said softly, her voice trembling. "Thank you for coming." It wasn't the apology Amelia had expected, but somehow it felt like a relief. For so long, she had imagined the confrontation, rehearsed the words she would say. She had imagined herself angry, full of accusations, but now, in front of them, the words didn't come. The anger that had once consumed her had faded, replaced by a deeper understanding, an understanding of the pain that had driven them to make the decisions they did. Amelia took a seat across from her parents, her hands resting on her lap as she studied them. The silence stretched between them like an impenetrable wall. She knew what she had to say, but she didn't know if they were ready to hear it. "I didn't come here to accuse you," Amelia began, her voice breaking the quiet. "I came here because I need you to see who I've become. I'm not the child you abandoned all those years ago. I've grown. I've built a life. I found my place in the world, despite everything. and I want you to know that." Henry shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped in his lap. "We never wanted to abandon you," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We just couldn't handle it. The way you looked, the way people would look at us." Rachel cut him off, her voice breaking. "I couldn't bear to look at you, not because I didn't love you, but because I couldn't accept you." She wiped her eyes, but the tears only seemed to deepen the silence. "I thought if I left you at the orphanage, someone would take better care of you, someone who could love you the way I couldn't." The admission hit Amelia like a punch to the gut. She had always known there was something more, some deeper reason behind their abandonment, but hearing it spoken aloud, hearing them admit that it was their own shame and fear that had led them to leave her, was almost too much to bear. "Do you realize what you've done?" Amelia asked, her voice steady but filled with pain. "Do you realize what it's like to grow up not knowing who you are, not knowing where you come from? To be told you're not worthy of love because of how you look?" Rachel nodded slowly, her face filled with regret. "I know," she whispered. "I know. And I've spent every day since regretting it. But I don't know how to fix it." The room was thick with unspoken words and unresolved tension. For a moment, it seemed like nothing would ever be the same again. But then, as Amelia sat there, something inside her shifted. She had come seeking answers, seeking recognition. But now, she realized that there would be no grand apology, no magical reconciliation. There was only the truth, the painful, messy truth that they had made a choice all those years ago, and that choice had shaped her life in ways she couldn't undo. But perhaps, she thought, there was room for something else, something that could move beyond the hurt. She didn't need forgiveness from them. What she needed was to see them as they were, as flawed and human as anyone else, and in that moment, she understood that her journey wasn't about them. It was about her. It was about her healing, her strength, and her ability to build the life on her own terms. "Maybe we'll never understand each other," Amelia said softly, standing up from the couch. "But I've found my family. I've found my purpose, and I don't need your approval to keep going." With that, Amelia turned and walked out of the Matthews house. She had come seeking closure, but what she left with was something far more powerful, a deeper understanding of who she was and what she had become. Amelia Matthews stood before her mirror in the dimly lit studio, her reflection staring back at her with a mixture of determination and vulnerability. The events of the past weeks, her confrontation with her birth parents, the painful truths that had been revealed, and the weight of her lifelong search for belonging, had brought her to a crossroads. She had thought the moment of meeting her parents would give her the clarity she so desperately sought. But instead, it had left her with a deeper question. What did forgiveness really mean? And more importantly, could she forgive them, not for their sake, but for hers? The studio was silent except for the rhythmic sound of Amelia's hands shaping a fresh lump of clay. The air was thick with the weight of her thoughts, but she focused on the work in front of her. Sculpting had always been her sanctuary, a place where words failed and emotions took form in the delicate manipulation of the material. As her fingers danced over the clay, it seemed to echo her own journey, a path of transformation, of accepting the rough edges and finding beauty in the cracks. Her heart still carried the sting of the past, the hurt of being abandoned, of being cast aside like something unworthy, was not something that could be easily erased. But as her hands worked with the clay, a realization began to form. Forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past, it was about letting go of the hold it had on her. It was about reclaiming her power and choosing to move forward, not because the past had been fixed, but because she was no longer willing to let it define her future. Amelia had spent years building a life out of the scraps left behind by her parents' rejection. She had risen to become one of the most respected artists of her generation, her work celebrated for its raw emotion and unflinching honesty. But even in her success, there was always a lingering shadow. She had built her identity on her art, on her ability to create beauty from pain. But deep down, she had never fully embraced who she was outside of her work. The moment she stepped into her parents' home had shaken her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Seeing Rachel and Henry, her biological parents, was like looking at two strangers whose decisions had shaped her life in unimaginable ways. Their regret, their distant sorrow, it all felt so out of reach, as if they were apologizing for a pain they had never truly understood. And yet, Amelia realized something profound. Their rejection had been a reflection of their own struggles, their own inability to accept their differences, and not a reflection of her worth. The more she thought about it, the more she understood that the real journey had always been about self-acceptance. The pain she had carried for so long, of being abandoned, of being told she wasn't enough, had clouded her own vision of herself. But in that moment, sitting alone in her studio with her hands covered in clay, she realized that the person she was now was not defined by her parents' choices. It was defined by how she chose to see herself. She was no longer the abandoned child at Hope's Haven Orphanage. She was an artist, a woman, a force of strength, and the only one who could shape her own future. Over the next few days, Amelia began to take small but significant steps toward healing. She had already begun the process of confronting her past, but now she had to confront the present. She needed to find a way to release the bitterness that had anchored her heart for so long. Forgiveness was a difficult concept, one that seemed impossible in the face of what her parents had done. But she knew that for her to truly move forward, she had to find a way to let go. She reached out to Mrs. Clara, her guardian and the woman who had been the constant in her life. Their relationship had always been one of love, understanding, and mutual respect. Mrs. Clara had watched Amelia grow from the little girl who had arrived at the orphanage, broken and scared, into the confident woman she had become. "Clara, how do you forgive someone who never asked for it? How do you move on when the past is still so painful?" Amelia asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Mrs. Clara, who had seen her own share of pain and loss, smiled gently. "Forgiveness isn't about them, Amelia. It's about freeing yourself. Holding on to anger and hurt only keeps you tied to the past. You're stronger than that. You've always been. You just have to choose to move forward, not because they deserve it, but because you deserve peace." The words resonated deep within Amelia. For so long, she had carried the weight of her parents' abandonment, but now she saw it for what it was, a choice they had made out of their own fears and insecurities. She couldn't change their past decisions, but she could choose how she responded to them. With newfound clarity, Amelia returned to her work, her hands moving with greater purpose. She began a new series of sculptures, each one a tribute to the concept of acceptance, accepting oneself, accepting others, and understanding the delicate balance between pain and growth. One of the sculptures, titled Rebirth, depicted a figure emerging from a cocoon, its wings still fragile but determined to fly. It was a symbol of her own transformation, a reflection of the strength she had cultivated in the face of rejection. As her art began to take shape, so did her understanding of forgiveness. She didn't have to forgive her parents for them. She had to forgive them for herself. And as she did, she began to experience a peace she hadn't thought possible. It wasn't that the pain disappeared. It was that it no longer controlled her. The chains of resentment that had bound her for so long were slowly breaking, piece by piece, like the clay she molded into forms of beauty. Amelia also began to reconnect with her biological family, but not out of obligation. She had made the decision to move forward with or without them, but she knew that healing wasn't a solitary journey. She had a half-sister, Sarah, who had reached out to her after their parents' reunion, and for the first time, Amelia allowed herself to explore the possibility of building a relationship with Sarah. It wasn't about replacing the family she had lost. It was about creating a new kind of family, one built on understanding, love, and mutual respect. As Amelia stood before the gallery opening for her latest exhibition, Rebirth, the crowd gathered, admiring her work. There were no longer whispers or judgmental stares, just admiration for the raw, emotional power of her sculptures. She had finally found her place in the world, not just as an artist, but as a woman who had come to terms with her past. Her art had always been about transformation, but now, Amelia realized, it was also about acceptance. She had accepted the past for what it was, and in doing so, had opened herself up to a future filled with endless possibilities. The journey was far from over, but as she looked around the room at the people who had supported her, the friends who had become her chosen family, she knew that she was no longer defined by her past. She was defined by the courage she had shown to face it, to forgive, and to move forward with hope in her heart. In that moment, Amelia Matthews stood tall, not as the abandoned child, but as a woman who had embraced her differences, healed from her past, and was ready to embrace the future with an open heart. The journey had been long, but it had led her here, a place of peace, acceptance, and new beginnings.